welcome to another installment of Janus Academy. We are still with the course of historical analogies, and this is going to be the 10th installment. Today we're going to be talking about Romanticism and Expressionism and how they come together, how they share many similarities, many dominant traits, and how they promote many of the same impulses. Now, previous installment was dedicated to neoclassicism and analytic cubism. And there we have shared a lot of those traits. We mentioned this very important situation that analytical cubism basically takes one set of aspects, or if you will, one dominant trait of neoclassicism and then develops it. Now, this is the tendency that is present in Romanticism and Expressionism. You could argue that Expressionism, as the stilistical formation that comes after Romanticism, or if we are to take into account certain researchers that claim that all of this is still Romanticism, we could also argue that, but let's stick with the previous premise. Expressionism also takes some of the aspects of Romanticism and further develops them. Now, we could argue that this is a broad tendency that is present in the 20th century, because we are already in the 20th century. But we could also say that this begins earlier in the second half of the 19th century. It of course has to do with the industrial society. It has to do with broad adoption of the scientific method, and it has to do with this general intent that we have to deeply analyze, deeply develop, and specialize. Now, what does this mean? If we're talking not only about arts, but about sciences, we can observe this tendency towards further and further specialization, that we tend to specialize in greater and greater and greater detail, and we tend to limit our domains of research. Now, this doesn't only apply to individuals, it also applies to entire fields of sciences. So let's say that if you're a student of medicine, you're very likely nowadays not going to be study all of medicine. You're not going to be able to treat every illness there is out there, but you're most likely going to specialize. And different countries, different cultures, different academic traditions will have varying degrees of specialization. So this tendency has been criticized by some. They called these kinds of professionals Fachidiot. This is a German term that says that you are expert in your own very narrowly defined field, but you're basically ignorant when it comes to everything else. So you lack the broadness of knowledge, you lack depth of understanding, you only know your little thing. And it really has to do with the industrial society as such. You could argue that one of the great commentators and of course critics of the industrial society, Karl Marx, argued that this is exactly what happens to workers in factories, that he gave this very famous example of a watch artisan, that back in the day we would have watchmakers be responsible for the entire watch. They would make the entire watch. They would have the knowledge and the understanding of the functioning of the mechanism of the watch. And so they would be able to create an entire watch themselves. This would take a long time because it's a very laborious, very sophisticated process. And the person who would get to create an entire watch would have this satisfaction of a complete work. They would have a sense of purpose. They would be proud of what they have achieved, especially if they created fine watches. Now, he argues that in the industrial society, what happens is that if we want to enhance productivity, if we want to be more efficient, if we want to enhance our efficiency, we specialize and we delegate. So he argues that we no longer have artisans who create entire watches themselves. We break this labor into many different parts, and basically we now have the situation where one worker is creating just one cog of a watch. So instead of having one worker handle the entire process, we have, let's say, 100 workers, but all of them creating one particular part of a watch until it's then assembled. Now, these workers are much more efficient. If you only do one thing in a very repetitive manner, you can churn out a lot more of that one thing than if you are doing many different things at the same time. This, of course, leaves you feeling very unsatisfied. Job is stupid, it's repetitive, it dulls you down. And ultimately, it contributes into alienation of yourself, not only from your labor or the fruits of your labor, but from the rest of the world as such. You could argue that Adam Smith, too, from a somewhat different perspective, argued over this situation though he mostly tend to see the positives of it. He gave the example not of watches but of pins. And he argued that if you divide the labor of creating a pin, instead of one worker creating, let's say, 40 pins a day, a factory of workers that divide labor between them can create 10,000 times more pins than if they just all create one entire pin. Now, why are we talking about all of this when it comes to Expressionism? Well, of course, this is very pertinent to our topic of conversation, because what happens in the field of science, what happens in the field of labor, also happens in the field of art. And we have this tendency that was present in neoclassicism and cubism. It's also present in Romanticism and Expressionism. This tendency to further develop details, to have smaller and smaller pieces of formerly vast field that are then developed, that are then enhanced, and that are then brought to far greater development. This is very poorly worded. To a far better result, let's put it this way, than what was previously possible when we had a more holistic, more comprehensive view and agency of things. You could also compare this to the field of science that back in the day, let's say before the Renaissance, before the Industrial Revolution, we had people who were true veritable polymaths. So we had people who were extremely not only proficient but creative, and I would say ingenious in many different fields of science. So people that would be chemists and alchemists, mathematicians, physicians, botanists, poets, etc., etc., etc. So nowadays it's unheard of. Nowadays, if you are a scientist, in most cases you will be scientist not only in one field, but in one very, very narrow branch of that field. We go to the situation that Expressionism develops certain traits that are already present in Romanticism. Now, these traits, we're going to present them now, will mostly have to do with the domain of the grotesque, of ugliness, of shock, of scandal, also of terror, and all the other fine things. You could say that these exist before Romanticism too. Obviously, you could argue that Expressionism doesn't only go back to Romanticism, it goes back to realism in an important manner. You could also then argue that realism is one branch of Romanticism. We're not going to go into that. But truth is that what we see present in Expressionism, this focus on strong emotions, this tendency to present people perhaps of lower social status than what we are used to in the world of arts, this tendency to scandalize, shock, and awe, this is all present in Romanticism, but also in realism. So we can think of people like Millet, like Corot, like Courbet. They too paved the way for Expressionism. Now we can go even further back to the past, and we can go to, let's say, certain aspects of the Renaissance. We can talk about Bosch, an excellent example, or the other part of the world, Grunewald. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. I was never too certain how to pronounce this name, Grunewald or Grunwald. Anyhow, you probably know who I'm talking about. So this is next to Dürer, one of the greatest German painters that ever lived. And this is a person that basically dealt in the style of Expressionism centuries before Expressionism was formulated as such. Someone who was very interested in pain, agony, gore, very, very peculiar stylization that was entirely different from anything that was happening in Italian Renaissance. So we have Expressionism, we could argue, be a sublimation of tendencies that were already present throughout history of art. I would argue, and this entire presentation will be about that, mostly in Romanticism, or more so in Romanticism than anywhere else. So these tendencies are going to be expanded as if under a magnifying glass. So we have this whole idea that what both Romanticism and Expressionism are all about, or what they're dominantly about, is aestheticism of ugliness, something that is really important for the 20th century. Most of the 20th century is very much invested in aestheticism of ugliness. So this means that we have a lot of painters, a lot of sculptors who do not care about beauty as it was previously the case. Now, we need to unravel this. We need to say a couple of words because it's just such an important trait of Expressionism. aestheticism of ugliness is a very peculiar thing. It doesn't necessarily just mean that the painting is going to be ugly. So there's a bit of a finesse to it. If you say that a painting, but also the sculpture, any form of visual arts really, is done in this way, it means that this is a still work that is well made. So this is still work that respects all of the main laws of visual arts. So you would have to have good harmony of colors, you would have to have good composition, good relation between the whole and its parts. So you would have to basically satisfy all of the canons of painting as an art form. But what you would represent would not be seen as pretty, it would not be seen as beautiful. Such are the standard ideas of those things. So let's say that you could present an ugly person, or a person who is tormented by very violent emotions, or who is in deep pain. You would not think that this is a beautiful sight, but it could still be done in a very well orchestrated manner. And so you could say that a lot of the paintings that deal with aestheticism of ugliness are made in such a way. This makes us think of, let's say, Otto Dix, a great example of a German expressionist and a great 20th century artist, who was a masterful illustrator, a great painter, someone who had a great technique, but someone who sought very intentionally to represent grotesque, ugly, monstrous, and repelling characters. So there was nothing attractive about many of Otto Dix's paintings, and this was a very deliberate decision on account of Otto Dix. You could argue that the technique that he was using was almost classical, was quite refined, but what he represented was not. So what he represented was decidedly expressionist and 20th century. So you could say, following this entire logic, that what Otto Dix was all about was this whole notion of making a very well-made painting, following all the laws of harmony, all the laws of visual integrity, but it would very much be about ugly situations, ugly characters, shocking, horrifying scenes. Now, this, of course, as you can imagine, has a lot to do with World War I, and Otto Dix in particular was very much shaped, was very much scarred, irreparably traumatized by the experience of World War I. He went to World War I as a young soldier who was very Nietzschean, who had this idea of glory, of patriotism, of valor, of courage, honor, all these lofty ideals, then that got completely massacred in the trenches of World War I. And they got massacred because World War I was the first major fully industrialized warfare, where we had the introduction of tanks, of planes, of mustard gas, of machine guns, of extremely large bombs and grenades. So we had all the machinery and all the machine-like tools that were there to basically deny all of humanity to warfare. So they were there to make sure that even if you were the most intelligent, courageous, self-sacrificing, cunning, intelligent, whatever kind of a soldier, you would still get blown up to smithereens by a bomb, by a missile that weighs a ton. And that when that missile lands onto your trench, you evaporate, and there's nothing you can do. There's literally nothing you can do. You cannot run a charge, let's say a tank. You will simply get crushed. So there's no point in charging a machine gun. So we say that these people who went to, and Otto Dix was one of them, they went to World War I thinking that it was going to be the pinnacle and actualization of their masculinity. It was going to be the proving ground of their patriotism, of their valor. And what they were faced instead was highly industrialized and highly depersonalized slaughter. So this was truly the most destructive phase of the industrial process. Before World War I, we had some reasons to be optimistic about the industrial initiative. We thought that it was going to bring abundance. We thought that it was going to bring heaven on earth, basically. But then World War I happened, and we understood that all of these beautiful machines, extremely productive, extremely efficient, could very easily be turned against us, and they could actually be geared towards our destruction. So the entire humanity was questioned, this time in a far more concrete, direct manner. Now, in some of the previous installments, in some of the previous lectures, we have discussed, and we shall do that again, how industrial process was seen as not only destructive but deeply disturbing and disruptive. But in this particular case, destruction brought about by industrialized warfare was beyond any speculation and beyond any doubt. It was just out there, plain for everyone to see. So, of course, expressionist paintings that were done around World War I, especially those done by Otto Dix, were, well, incredibly dark. They were depressing. And you could argue that the only thing that was more depressing than paintings that and sketches and etchings that Otto Dix has done during World War I were artworks that he's done after World War I, because it was after World War I that we got to this intra-war period that was marked, that was scarred rather, by this deep loss of faith, loss of faith in humanity, in sense, in meaning. So we had nothing but trauma and paranoia. So we called these generations that came after World War I lost generations, because these were people that were basically destroyed by war. Their soul was crushed. And this is something that left indelible traces not only in intra-war period between World War I and II, but really on the entirety of the 20th century. Now, if we want to properly explain Expressionism, and especially how it connects to Romanticism, we need to understand that Expressionism begins slightly before World War I. Now, this is something that, how should I say, in the most somber and tragic of ways, clicks very well with aesthetics and interest of Expressionism, but the tendency begins before World War I. And you could say that the main traits are being developed, are being presented before World War I. World War I really comes as a confirmation of angst and of anxiety that is already present in our society. So Expressionism begins to formulate these traits, and this is, of course, something that has a lot to do with Romanticism, because a lot of Romanticism is about exploring the nether regions of the human spirit. It's about exploring whatever is not pretty, whatever is not considered decent. So it's all about topics that are not suitable for a fine dinner party, if you will. So this is where the quality art begins. So think many of romantic writers, poets, and painters. So when we get to the topics that are unsuitable for a fine dinner party. So you could argue that ugliness and grotesque are equally present in Romanticism and in Expressionism. And these really have a lot to do with whatever is seen as inspiration for Romanticism and then Expressionism. So you could say that in terms of visual arts, especially architecture, Expressionists are very favorable of Gothic art. So in Europe, and generally you could say America as well by this point, we have these two revival movements that are most important. One is neoclassical, the other one is Gothic revival or neo-Gothic. So they coexist, and they basically depict very different ideas of the world. They depict very different worldviews, and they carry different messages. So you could say that people who were active in Expressionist movement were much more in favor of Gothic style and whatever that represented than they were of neoclassical style. You could argue that they saw Gothic style and they liked Gothic style for all of the wrong reasons. Now, this is the case with Romanticism as well. The great example of this would be a very distinguished poet and essayist and novelist of the Romanticism period. This is Victor Hugo, and his particular take on Gothic art. So Hugo's idea was that he liked Gothic art, but he liked it for all the wrong reasons. He thought that Gothic art is ugly, it's unbecoming, it's cumbersome, it's grotesque, it's scandalously mismatched and deprived of harmony. And personally, I think nothing could be further from the truth, but this is just the way he felt. So a good example of this is the very famous novel called Notre Dame de Paris, translated to English as Hunchback of Notre Dame, that was written by Victor Hugo, basically to save the Cathedral of Notre Dame, because this was in 1831 when novel was published. People were seriously considered, the Mary of Paris was seriously considering of demolishing Notre Dame. So there was this idea that they were destroying most of the old city of Paris so as to make way for the new modern, industrialized, functioning metropolis, and that Notre Dame was very badly damaged. It was in dilapidated state of disrepair, especially after the French Revolution. So there was a public debate of what they were to do with this very cumbersome and at that time seen as unnecessary building. Now, this is, of course, all rather incredible nowadays, especially after the fire that took place at Notre Dame, when we were all made aware of just how important that building was and how dear it was to all of us. But yes, people in Paris some 200 years ago actively debated whether they should leave it there or whether they should demolish it. Yeah, that really happened. So you could say that Gogh argued that although this is an incredibly, immensely ugly structure, again, I could not disagree with this more, we should leave it there because it's an important part of our history, it's an important part of character of Paris, and he argued that there is indeed a lot of charm in ugliness. He has a couple of very influential essays on the topic of grotesque and how important it really is, how not beautiful, but how interesting it is. And he argued something that will become the staple of Romanticism, that there is a lot of innovation, a lot of originality in ugliness. So this is what is also true with Expressionism, because that style too is all about originality, it's all about innovation. Now, this is another thing that we need to unpack because it's a very interesting term that helps us understand development of art and directions in which art is going. Now, innovation was a derogatory term up until the late 18th century, and it was basically used to describe artists who were technically inferior. Because we remember that back in this particular time, and in this worldview, art was all about skill. It was not about invention. So you were a good artist if you were able to copy a good model. This is what was expected of you as an artist. It was not expected of you to invent new things. If you were inventing new things, if you were being innovative, you were basically wandering aimlessly. You were wandering away from one true ideal of beauty that you were supposed to be copying, that you were supposed to be trying to get as close to as humanly possible. So you could say that people of Romanticism, like Victor Hugo, decidedly embrace this attitude. They don't really question it quite as much. They say, yes, we are all for ugliness. We're all for scandal. We're all for monstrosities. We love them. They are much more interesting than something that is beautiful. So they present this attitude that beauty is somehow boring and that ugliness is interesting. It is surprising. It is something that always looks out of place. So they develop this veritable fascination and admiration of everything that is ugly in a state of disarray and in a state that would be opposite of harmony. Marquis de Sade, who does not really belong to this period, he is alive around the French Revolution, also gives an explanation of this in his own way when he is talking about sexual attraction and eros and all those other things. And he says that admiring a beautiful face or a beautiful body is basically like walking through a pleasant meadow. So it's like walking on a flat terrain, which can be nice. It's not terribly challenging. It's kind of boring, really. And we get sick of it very soon. On the other end of that is a veritable ugly appearance, either an ugly body or an ugly face. And he compares this to climbing a mountain, a rocky, inhospitable, savage mountain that is dangerous, but it is all the more interesting because it is so dangerous, because it is sometimes downright life-threatening, and because it's so irreproachable. So he argues that ugliness is far more interesting than beauty, and people of Romanticism era do the same thing. So Victor Hugo does the same thing when he explains his interest in Notre Dame, and when he explains why we should maintain Notre Dame. Again, this is hilarious because today we tend to think that Notre Dame is beautiful. I find it beautiful. Gothic art in general is supremely beautiful, but that's not how it was seen. Victor Hugo argues that we should keep this jewel of medieval art because it is so ugly. It is its very value. We appreciate it. We need it for its ugliness. So this is a very different state of mind. And you could argue the same thing when it comes to Expressionism. So they too value ugliness. They too want to dedicate themselves to ugliness. So not just because of World War One. This is again something that comes as a confirmation, but on account of the entire society as it was even before World War One. So we need to address this statement, and we need to address the fact that everything that Expressionism is all about begins way before World War One. Now, I am talking, of course, about the turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century. I'm talking about the period that is still labeled by some as La Belle Époque, the beautiful era. The era that is defined by colonialism. We have this major influx of resources, of wealth into mostly Western European countries. That is, of course, extremely detrimental to the rest of the world, that later we started calling the Third World. So these countries, these territories, domains, continents even, are in state of abysmal poverty and incredible suffering. But people of Western Europe don't really care about all of this, because they get to develop incredible buildings, incredible bridges and roads, and indeed works of art. But as is always the case, this balance, this harmony is felt, and it creeps into the European society. So European people start growing interest in their colonies. We've addressed this when we talked about Fauvism. So they start traveling to these colonies, they start experiencing them, they start bringing back colonial presence to Europe itself. So this was very, very much the case in Cubism. So we know that Picasso, for example, based his entire style in African art. There would be no Picasso as he was if it weren't for his fascination with African art. So we have this basically two-lane communication between Western Europe and its colonies. And we have this understanding that even in Western Europe, we have this tremendous social stratification. We have the workers who have downright horrible lives, and we have the wealthy elite that have, well, a lot more wealth than they ever need to. So this is also the period where we don't quite have workers' rights fully developed. We have not necessarily fully established the notions such as social security, medical security, vacations, weekends. All of these things are only slowly starting to be implemented. But it's a transitional period. And what is also transitional is this major influx of people that move from the countryside into cities. So this is a major driving force both for Romanticism and even more so Expressionism, because it's even more present in Expressionism. It's even more present in the early 20th century. This whole idea that due to industrialization and due to the industrial process, many people can no longer live in the countryside. They can no longer sustain themselves by selling food they produce on a small farm, because we have large farms, large monopolies or oligopolies that can produce food much cheaper, and then they can then sell food much cheaper, and they're driving all these small producers out of the market. So these small producers have only one choice, that's to go to the city and to start working in a factory. So they change their lives considerably. They change the natural environment for the highly industrialized environment. And we need not spend our time talking about the state of factories back in the day, how safe, that is unsafe they were, how polluted they were, what were the general working conditions, etc. So this all creates a very tense atmosphere. It creates a lot of uneasiness. The question of colonialism and colonial exploitation, the question of workers' rights and workers' exploitation. So this overall misery on one end and incredible luxury on the other. So all of these factors create a very strained, very tense atmosphere in society. And it has its formulation in the era of Expressionism. It has its formulation in this era that decidedly takes an interest into everything that is opposite to beauty. Now, these social issues have their reflection in the world of art. You could say that this begins with realism, and this is why we say that realism is one of the great influences on Expressionism, because we have this idea that, of course, is vastly simplified, but still merits mention, that ugliness belongs to poverty and beauty belongs to the wealthy. So we're just going to put it out there. And this truly is the case in the world of arts, is that if we deal with aestheticism of ugliness, at least in this period, we are dealing with a certain class of people. So we are not dealing with the very wealthy. And you could also say that there was this general attitude that people who saw themselves as the elites, cultural, financial, etc., were very much in favor of neoclassical style, again, the dominant era back in the day, whereas the people who were more middle class or even lower middle class were about all these innovative, avant-garde, revolutionary experimental styles like Impressionism, Neo-Impressionism, Fauvism, Dada, Surrealism, and Expressionism. So it's this idea that there is a very strong class dimension in this particular art, and this also takes us back to Romanticism that in its own right has a very strong class dimension and a very, very strong political dimension, something we've addressed when we spoke about Renaissance of the Paleologue and Romanticism, when we spoke about this idea of nationalism and how important it is. Nationalism truly was seen as, or was presented rather, not necessarily that it ever was, but it was presented as the bourgeois middle class ideology. So you could say that the similar issue translates itself towards Expressionism, that is a very class oriented and a very class conscientious style. So we have this overall doubt in the functioning of the world. We have the fear of losing our humanity to machinery. We have the corruption of society clearly seen. We also have the clearly seen by these artists. And we also have a question of syphilis. This is really important. Syphilis is a major cultural force, I mean, in its own right, that defines the society, that especially defines the late 19th and the early 20th century. Now, this is a period where we still don't have a functioning cure for syphilis. And this particular disease that is sexually transmitted, amongst other ways, is basically one of the symbols of this society because it's a symbol of corruption, it's a symbol of everything that is wrong with society, of this incurable disease that eats at the very heart of who we are, of our community. All the more given that syphilis is introduced to Europe when the colonial period begins. And we have this fairly strong assumption that syphilis comes from the New World. So back in the New World, it was a type of disease that was not as detrimental to their population as it was to the European, which is similar how certain European diseases are absolutely lethal in Africa. Something as banal as the flu can kill millions in populations that are not adapted to it, and similarly so, how certain African diseases are absolutely devastating for the people of the European continent who are not accustomed to them. So you could say that syphilis wreaked havoc in its time and was basically one of the symbols of this particular period, and not only in terms of public health, not only in terms of class affair, but also in terms of visuals, because syphilis was something that after enough time left indelible traces, something that marked people, that left traces on their physiques, especially if it was intergenerational, which sadly it also could be. So you could say that this is something that is adopted in the era of Expressionism, something that truly defines era of Expressionism. If you think about people like Schiele, Egon Schiele, who had syphilis himself, this is the main force driving his entire expression, his entire aesthetics. So this question of guilt because he gave syphilis to his wife, this question of feeling inadequate, of feeling marked, left out of general humanity and progress of humanity, this idea of having an incurable disease that is slowly destroying his mind and body, all of this has a lot to do with expressionist aesthetics, even for the painters and writers and poets and sculptors and architects who did not necessarily suffer from syphilis themselves like Schiele did, but they saw it as a very good representation of everything they were interested in. Now, there's another question here that has to do with the character of this era, and that has to do with romantic inspiration or presence of romanticism in era of Expressionism. And that is the whole topic of individuality and individual freedom, especially the possibility of individual freedom in the mechanized industrial world. Now, this is something that takes us back to the story of Romanticism. We said that Romanticism happened for most of it alongside Neoclassicism. And Romanticism is possibly more important and prevalent in the literature, especially in poetry, whereas Neoclassicism is arguably more present and more impressive in visual arts than it is in literary arts. Now, the thing with both of these eras is that they are basically the last gasp of an old world. When I say this, I mean a very peculiar aspect of old world, something that has to do with the very masculine obsession with warfare and with military glory. So this idea that as a man, you truly need to prove yourself, your masculinity, your courage, your valor, in the battlefield. So this is the pinnacle of your manly existence, is going to war and showing what you're made of there in the context of the war. So this was the case that people, such was the folly of its time, did not tremendously value other people who would get to live very long lives. If you lived a long life, that means that you failed to die on the battlefield, so you failed your masculine mission. You were a coward, you were not worthy of existence. So this was especially around the rise of Napoleon, this particular attitude that dying in war for your country is the greatest thing you can ever do. And this particular attitude lasted all up until World War I. Now, we're going back to Romanticism and Neoclassicism, chronologically speaking, to address this, because while all of this fascination with war was around, something else was happening that was entirely different and that was entirely opposed to aesthetics and purpose and substance of war. And this whole thing is, again, the industrial process. Now, if we're thinking about the industrial process, we are thinking about factory work, we are thinking about office work. So we are thinking about very repetitive, dull, regular, orderly existence. So if you live in industrial society and if you work either in an office or in a factory, you have days that look very much alike, day in, day out. So clock in, clock out. You work from 9 to 5, or if it's the 19th century, from 7 to 10. But every day tends to look the same. So your days are not filled with heroics, they're not filled with glory, they're not filled with self-sacrifice, camaraderie, all these lofty ideals that you get to exercise in war, or at least in theory. They're not filled with great fear or excitement or adrenaline rushes. No, you basically go to your office and you work whatever it is that you do there for an entire day, more or less, and then you go back home, you sleep, and then you do the same thing again. So we had this immense cognitive dissonance that was all the more made apparent by figures like Napoleon, that on one end, our attention is entirely turned towards this comet, a veritable human comet of Napoleon, and the blazing trace he left. And on the other, while we were busy looking at Napoleon and his taking over the world, we failed to notice that what was actually taking over the world was the industrial mode of production, which meant very boring lives for a lot of people, which meant something that we started our presentation with, specialization, which meant that you were no longer, like Hegel argued back in the old world, people would have to have many different skills. So even a king, like the Odyssey, would be able to make their own bed. When I say make their own bed, I don't mean do the sheets, but literally create an entire bed, do it out of wood and create the whole thing, a bed as a piece of furniture. So it's this idea that the industrial process removes us from the material world, and we lose this polyvalence that we formerly had. Let's say that if you are a peasant and you live in the countryside, you have to have a lot of different skills. So none of them would be terribly developed. They would stay at a fairly basic to intermediary level, but you would have a lot of them. You would have to be able to deal with the cattle, you would have to be able to till the soil, you would have to be able to go through the woods, to read animal traces, to understand the weather on a much deeper level than people in the cities are ever obliged to. So you would have to have all these different skills. You would have to know how to repair a piece of clothes, you would have to know how to repair a house, and all the other types of work that we no longer have, because again, we are so insanely specialized that if we know how to do something, we know how to do that one thing and nothing else. So this is exactly the same situation in art. But back to this whole idea of Romanticism, people are growing aware of this, that there is this looming danger of industry, not just taking over our flesh, making us slaves of factories, but also taking over our minds, making us dull, making us robotic, making us live these repetitive lives. And so we basically escaped to fantasy of acting our own Napoleons, each and every one of us. So when we are looking at both Romanticism and Expressionism, we are looking at a very vivid and very powerful reaction to this particular situation. We are trying to escape from mundanity of everyday life, from repetition, from this endless cycle that our lives have came back to. So this whole idea that there's nothing new happening, we live lives that are incredibly stale. And this is one of the reasons why we start appreciating ugliness, grotesque, why we want to be surprised by things that are, well, so monstrous and so unappealing that they shake us out of our existence. So you could say that Kafka, who argued for himself that he was very decidedly not an expressionist, he was entirely against this whole thing. Kafka said that art was an axe whose function was to break the ice of everyday life. So we have this idea of everyday life being basically like a frozen lake. Nothing happens, everything stays the same. It's the horror of mundanity. And then art is there to break this ice, to tear it apart. Now, if you think about hacking at ice with an axe, this is a very violent process. And this tells you about what kind of art we're talking about. It tells you about the character of this art. What is expected out of this art? Well, to break ice with an axe. So you have to strike ice very, very hard if you want to break it. So this is a violent process. And the effect of it is also violence. It's tearing ice apart. So this tells you why this particular art was so involved in, well, all things violent. Now, if we are talking about the roots of Expressionism, we have to say a couple of words about Van Gogh, a very famous artist, very important artist, someone who technically is situated in post-Impressionism, but who really represents a bridge between Neo-Impressionism and Expressionism. So he is really this transitional stage between the two. So when you look at Van Gogh, you can see traces of Fauvism, you can see traces of pointillism very clearly. And you can see that the expressiveness of his works is really what matters the most. Now, Van Gogh is quite different to, let's say, Otto Dix that we already mentioned, or Schiele, or Oskar Kokoschka, or these undoubtedly talented people, because Van Gogh has a very peculiar technique, or rather, to be more precise, he doesn't have a technique, so his paintings are not terribly well made. And again, not to open the entire chapter that we already covered by Impressionism and intentionally poorly made paintings for a very specific goal, this was not the case with Van Gogh. He just could not he could not paint. So he only started painting when he was 30. His entire painting career lasted for 6 years before he killed himself or was murdered. There's a bit of a controversy when it comes to this. So you could say that Van Gogh wasn't a skilled painter, and very few people could argue this. But the whole thing with him is that it wasn't really important if he was skilled or not, because he completely displaced the field of what art is. He did not see art as relegated or connected to skill, so he definitely wasn't an Ingres or Picasso for that matter. He displaced the field of art towards something that speaks of our individuality and something that speaks of our freedom of expression. So what Van Gogh has done with his art is that he psychologized it tremendously. And this is why his art was and still is so interesting to psychologists and to psychiatrists, because they analyze his personality. And if you analyze Van Gogh's art, it truly, in this particular manner, it truly is incredibly rich and layered, and it gives you a lot to work with. So let's say that visual analysis of Van Gogh's work will not offer tremendous fruits. You will not get very far, but if you analyze his personality, his psychological issues, his bipolarity, what we think was probably schizophrenia and depression, you will have a most wonderful time if you're interested in these things. So you analyze Van Gogh on this account, and his paintings are a treasure trove. So you could say that with Van Gogh, art definitively is no longer about skill, sophistication, about mastery of the media. So art becomes really about artistic person. And this is what takes us to Expressionism. This is what takes us to the very term expressionist, because these people do not seek to represent the world as it is or as they see it. No, they push further downwards into the depths of their personalities, into the depths of their psychologies, into what is most decidedly Chtonian. So they want to bring everything that is buried deep inside of them to the surface. And such is the assumption of this particular era, and such is the general zeitgeist. What is buried deep inside is very much Chtonian and is basically nothing but monsters. So this is a very well-defined attitude that if we dig deep inside, we're going to keep finding stranger and stranger and stranger things. We want to properly understand aesthetics of Munch, of Nolde, of Kokoschka, not quite as much, but certainly Otto Dix, and certainly Van Gogh, someone who came before all of them. We really want to understand this idea that the deeper we go, the stranger and stranger things we're going to find. And then this becomes an ambition of the sorts, that stranger and stranger things that we discover in our depths is something we want to share with the world. Now, I want to go back to this premise that reaction to the industrial era has a lot to do with redefining humanity and protecting humanity and actualizing a very specific trait of humanity that is seen as animalistic, raw, impulsive, etc. So I want to go back to this idea that humanity that we're trying to actualize is seen as down and dirty and deeply ugly, is seen as monstrous. Now, I use this term quite intentionally because the term monster comes from the Latin to show. So something that shows itself, something that announces itself. It's like this idea of something you have to look at because it's incredibly important for your own survival, something that has to be seen. So monstrous is something that has to be seen. And it's this idea that we take that out of the depths of our personality. So you could argue that what Romanticism is all about, grotesque, ugliness, aestheticism of ugliness, and what Expressionism is all about, all of those same things, has to do with how we see humanity. And then I would put in an extra step, it has to do with how we see God. Now, why do I mention God in all of this? Well, we have Expressionist painters who are deeply religious and who are deeply dedicated to this question. So we know that there is a general tendency in world of art that begins with the French Revolution, that art becomes overwhelmingly secular, and that we have fewer and fewer religious paintings. Not that they completely disappear, of course, but it is nowhere near the situation of before the French Revolution, when church was the main patron and the main driving force behind arts. It becomes a bit of a curiosity, really, in the 20th century to have artists most decisively engaged with the questions of the divine, with questions of the religious. It becomes rather an oddity than a rule, though of course there's many of those, and there will be many of those. So this is not something that we can ever truly stop dealing with. So we mentioned two names in particular, Emil Nolde and Otto Dix. So they're very invested in Christian lore, and they have a very deep relationship with God, and we see this in their works. Now, Nolde doesn't really have a lot of works that are dedicated to this topic, but the ones that he does are seen as his most important work, the very pinnacle of his expression. His Jesus series, for example. So these are the most important things that he's ever done, and personally most important to him and to his environment. So there was this awareness on account of Nolde that these were basically his creative pinnacle. These were his zenith. So you could say the same thing about Otto Dix, a person who becomes increasingly more religious in the later stages of his life. So after World War I, he is very conservative, he is very anti-progressive, he's very anti-feminist. We have some beautiful works to substantiate this claim. But his conservative nature only grows in this very peculiar direction. He becomes more and more religious, and he starts treating the more and more religious topics, and even the secular topics that he's treating them as if they were religious. So it really has this whole idea of individualism and relation to God being brought together. So the further we dig inside ourselves, the closer we get to God. Now, this is something that arguably is the Jungian inspiration in all of this. We mentioned Freud a couple of times, so we can mention him this time as well, because his presence is very, very important. It's very inspirational to Expressionism as an era. However, same is true for Jung, because Jung has this very famous idea of globally present, globally shared subconsciousness that is accessible by everyone. So Jung claims that we all share this same root, this monomyth, if you will, and that the whole purpose of art is basically to get to this archetypal level of unified consciousness that is shared by everyone. So collective unconsciousness. And this, of course, has a lot to do with God. This is how you can address divinity. You could argue that the collective unconscious soul, rather than mind, is basically what God is all about. So if you want to take this particular path to understanding of divinity, it's a perfectly legitimate way to do so. So you could argue that art, as it was understood by these religious artists, was basically seen like this. They were using whatever was a path of their individual freedom. They were using everything that was ugly and scandalous and monstrous and grotesque as a way to reach God. So this was their path to divinity. They did not see beauty as a path to divinity. This is something that belonged to the old world, something that had to do with the world before the industrial process and all of the dilemmas and indeed horrors that it brought about. So they were engaged with a very different idea of how God announces themselves. And we could also say that this is not the first case in history that this happens. You could argue that we have the same thing present in Baroque. We have the same thing present in German Renaissance, in Dutch Renaissance to a certain extent. So we have a lot of grotesque present in all of these eras, but nowhere more so than in Romanticism, where grotesque is theoretized, where it's acknowledged, where it's basically created very intentionally. And in Expressionism, when grotesque and ugliness seems to be the sole focus of these people that basically specialize in grotesque, that specialize in everything that is different and everything that is in this particular line of expression. Now, it's very important to understand that when Expressionists were being expressive, they were doing so because they found art to be emotional for all things. They thought that art was all about invoking strong feelings, and that inventiveness was very important in this regard. So we can only invoke feelings, strong feelings, which is what art is all about, so they would argue, if we present something strange, unusual, and original. So you could argue that emotions were basically visually represented through their paintings and through their statues and their buildings, if we're talking about architecture. So yet again, you go back to Van Gogh as the defining influence on Expressionism and someone who made downright ugly paintings that were filled with anxiety, that were filled with terror, with sadness, melancholy. So they were filled with all these feelings, and he gave them a very ugly appearance. And if you look at all of Emil Nolde's creation and most of Otto Dix's creation, if not all of them, you see the same thing. Not so with Kokoschka. I think his paintings, although they look very rough, are actually fairly beautiful in the standard understanding of that term. But if you look at Munch, yeah, you could see some very deliberate ugliness. His most famous painting, The Scream, is obviously not made to be pretty. So you see these things, and they carry a very interesting idea that emotions that are at the core of their expression, which obviously comes from Romanticism, are represented as incredibly ugly. Now, this is a very Cartesian notion, that you have the solar world be beautiful and Chthonian world be ugly, and you have a deliberate interest in Chthonian, in ugliness, in monstrosity, and grotesque, And you basically see human emotions as belonging to this realm. I find this to be very curious. It's like you want to actualize, and you want to present, and you want to bring value, give value to this thing that you see as ugly. So it really takes us back to Victor Hugo, who thought that Gothic style was ugly, but that was its value. So it's as if that all of expressionism is about telling us that we need to be in touch with our humanity, we need to get in touch with ourselves, which means that we need to get in touch with God, but who we are is very ugly. So we are ugliness, we are these abominations, actually. So I find this to be very curious, because it doesn't speak very well of feelings, of emotions, of this sensitive and sensual side of our characters. So it's the same thing as what Victor Hugo thought of Gothic art. It's like, yes, it's terrible, yes, it's disgusting, yes, it looks like, not to give any indecent comparisons here, but we need it because this is who we are, and this represents us, and ugliness is much more interesting than beauty, and all of these things. So I find that this is all terribly curious, and I find that this takes us back to what was inspiring to Victor Hugo. It takes us back to the medieval period. And we shall understand in later series that are to come, later lectures, sorry, still a part of the same series, that medieval period is indeed very, very present. Not only through Expressionism, not only through Romanticism, that is an indelible and clear inspiration for Expressionism, but also through the style of Gothic revival that is incredibly influential in more than one ways. So in next lectures, we're going to be addressing how Gothic revival deals with other parts of the avant-garde, with other aspects of modern art. I would like to hear from the listeners if anyone is a fan of expressionist art. This is art that had an extremely strong political charge. As we addressed a couple of times, it was very socially marked, it was very socially engaged. This is the reason why the Nazis gathered all of the expressionist art that they could, and they threw together this exhibition that was called the Exhibition of Degenerate Art. And of course, a lot of this art was destroyed after the exhibition, so it was to show the people of the Third Reich what art was not supposed to be all about. So, as they called it, degenerate art. Everything that was wrong, everything that was false, everything that was downright despicable. Now, of course, after the war was over and after the Nazis lost, it was a badge of honor in a way to have had your art displayed in this exhibition. That at the time was a damning statement that would basically end your artistic career. Now, this almost happened even to very famous people like the aforementioned Otto Dix. Some of his works were presented at this exhibition, and although he was an honorable veteran of World War I who was decorated for courage on the battlefield, although he was wounded, quite grievously so actually, he too was seen as a degenerate, and he too was seen as unwanted in the new society that these people were building. So, not only that these people were politically engaged and politically ambitious, they were also seen as such by their political class and ideological adversaries. And you could say the same thing about Romanticism. We were already talking about how politically aware Romanticism was and how much it had to do with nationalism and all of that. So, yes, I will welcome your comments. I hope this was interesting, and I hope to see you again soon to talk about Gothic revival and Dada and how they come together. Ciao.